Warning: this story may contain profanity and language that may be offensive to some. Also, don't forget to show the author some love in the comments. Okay, then we begin. Runner of the Lost Library. Written by Scare in a Box. Thump! The air between its pages cushioned the closing of the tattered 70s mechanical manual as Peter's fingers gripped them together. Another book. Another miss. The soft noise echoed ever so softly across the library, rippling between the cheap pressboard shelving clad with black powder-coated steel. From the entrance, a bespectacled lady with her frizzy greying hair tied up into a lazy bob glared over at him. He was a regular here, though he'd never particularly cared to introduce himself. Besides, he wasn't really there for the books. With a sly grin, he slid the book back onto the shelf. One more shelf checked, he'd come back for another one next time. She might have thought it suspicious that he'd never checked anything out or sat down to read. But her suspicions were none of his concern. He'd scoured just about every shelf in the place, spending just about every day there of late, to the point that it was beginning to grow tiresome. Perhaps it was time to move on to somewhere else after all. Across polished concrete floors, his sneakers squeaked as he turned on his heels to head towards the exit, walking into the earthy notes of espresso that seeped into the air from the little cafe by the entrance. As with any coffee shop, would-be authors toiled away on their sticker-laden laptops working on something likely few people would truly care about, while others supped their lattes while reading a book they just pulled off the shelves. Outside the windows, people passed by busily, cars a mere blur, while time slowed to a crawl in this warehouse for the mind. As he pushed open the doors back to the outside world, his senses swole to everything around him, the smell of car exhaust and the sewers below, the murmured chatter from the people in the streets, the warmth of the sun peeking between the high-rises, buffeting his exposed skin, the crunching of car tires on the asphalt and their droning engines. This was his home, and he was just as small a part of it as anyone else here. But Peter saw the world a little differently than other people. He enjoyed parkour, going around marinas and parks, and treating the urban environment like his own personal playground. A parked car could be an invitation to verticality, or a shop's protruding sign could work as a swing or help to pull him up. Vaulting over benches and walls with fluid precision, he revelled in the satisfying rhythm of movement. The sound of his weathered Converse hitting the pavement was almost musical, as he transitioned seamlessly from a climb-up to a swift wall run, scaling the side of a brick fountain to perch momentarily on its edge. He also enjoyed urban exploring, seeking out forgotten rooftops and hidden alleyways where the city revealed its quieter, secretive side. Rooftops, however, were his favourite, granting him a bird's-eye view of the sprawling city below as people darted to and fro. The roads and streets were like the circulatory system to a living, thriving thing, a perspective entirely lost on those beneath him. There, surrounded by antennas and weathered chimneys, he would pause to breathe in the cool air and watch the skyline glow under the setting sun. Each new spot he uncovered felt like a secret gift, a blend of adventure and serenity that only he seemed to know existed. Lately, though, his obsession in libraries was due to an interest that had blossomed seemingly out of nowhere. He enjoyed collecting bugs that died between the pages of old books. There was something fascinating about them, something that he couldn't help but think about late into the night. He had a whole process of preserving them, a meticulous routine honed through months of practice and patience. Each specimen was handled with the utmost care. He went to libraries and second-hand bookshops and could spend hours and hours flipping through the pages of old volumes, hoping to find them. Back in his workspace, a tidy room filled with shelves of labeled jars and shadow boxes, he prepared them for preservation. He would delicately pose the insects on a foam board, holding them in place to be mounted in glass frames, securing them with tiny adhesive pads or pins so that they seemed to float in place. Each frame was a work of art, showcasing the insects' vibrant colors, intricate patterns, and minute details, from the iridescent sheen of a beetle's shell to the delicate veins of a moth's wings. He labeled every piece with its scientific name and location of discovery, his neatest handwriting a testament to his dedication. The finished frames lined the walls of his small apartment, though he'd never actually shown anyone all of his hard work. It wasn't for anyone else, though. This was his interest, his obsession. It was entirely for him. He'd been doing it for long enough now that he'd started to run into the issue of sourcing his materials. His local library was beginning to run out of the types of books he'd expect to find something in. There wasn't much point in going through newer tomes, though the odd insect might find its way through the manufacturing process, squeezed and desiccated between the pages of some self-congratulatory autobiography or pseudo-scientific self-help book. No, he needed something older, something that had been read and put down with a small life snuffed out accidentally or otherwise. The vintage ones were especially outstanding, sending him on a contemplative journey into how the insect came to be there, the journey its life and its death had taken it on before he had the chance to catalogue and admire it. He didn't much like the idea of being the only person in a musty old vintage bookshop, however, being scrutinized as he hurriedly flipped through every page and felt for the slightest bump between the sheets of paper to detect his quarry, staring at him as though he was about to commit a crime. No, they wouldn't understand. There was, however, a place on his way home he liked to frequent. The coffee there wasn't as processed as the junk at the library, and they seemed to care about how they produced it. It wasn't there for convenience. It was a place of its own among the artificial lights, advertisements, the concrete buildings, and the detached conduct of everyday life. Better yet, they had a collection of old books. More for decoration than anything, but Peter always scanned his way through them nonetheless. Inside the dingy rectangular room filled with tattered leather-seated booths and scratched tables, their ebony lacquer cracking away, Peter took a lungful of the air in a whooshing nasal breath. It was earthy, peppery, with a faint musk. One of those places with its own signature smell he wouldn't find anywhere else. At the bar, a tattooed man in a shirt and vest gave him a nod with a half smile. His hair cascaded to one side, with the other shaved short. Orange spaces blew out the size of his ears, and he had a twisted leather bracelet on one wrist. Vance. While he hadn't cared about the people at the library, he at least had to speak to Vance to order a coffee. They'd gotten to know each other over the past few months at a distance, merely in passing, but he'd been good enough to supply Peter a few new books in that time. One of them even had a small cricket inside. "Usual?" Vance grunted. "Usual," Peter replied. With a nod, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a round ivory-coloured cup, spinning around and fiddling with the espresso machine in the back. "There's a few new books in the back booth, since that seems to be your sort of thing." He tapped out the grounds from the previous coffee. "Go on, I'll bring it over." Peter passed a few empty booths, and one with an elderly man sat inside, who lazily turned and granted a half smile as he walked past. It wasn't the busiest spot, but it was unusually quiet. He pulled the messy stack of books from the shelves above each seat, and carefully placed them on the seat in front of him, stacking them in neat piles on the left of the table. With a squeak and a creak of the leather beneath him, he set to work. He began by reading the names on the spines, discarding a few into a separate pile that he'd already been through. Vance was right though, most of these were new. One by one he started opening them. He'd grown accustomed to the feeling of various grains of paper from different times in history, the musty scents kept between the pages telling him their own tale of the book's past. To his surprise, it didn't take him long to actually find something, this time a cockroach. It was an adolescent, likely scooped between the pages in fear as somebody ushered it inside before closing the cover with haste. He stared at the faded spatter around it, the way its legs were snapped backwards, and carefully took out a small pouch from the inside of his jacket. With an empty plastic bag on the table and tweezers in his hand, he started about his business. "Did you find what you were looking for?" came a voice from his right. It was rich and deep, reverberating around his throat before it emerged. There was a thick accent to it, but the sudden nature of his call caused Peter to drop his tweezers. It was a black man with weathered skin, covered in deep wrinkles like canyons across his face. Thick lips wound into a smile. He wasn't sure if it was friendly or predatory, and yellowed teeth peeked out from beneath. Across his face was a large set of sunglasses, completely opaque, and patches of grey beard hair that he'd missed when shaving. Atop his likely bald head sat a brown-grey pinstripe fedora that matched his suit, while wispy tufts of curly grey hair poked from beneath it. Clutched in one hand was a wooden stick, thin, lightweight, but gnarled and twisted. It looked like it had been carved from driftwood of some kind, but had been carved with unique designs that Peter didn't recognize from anywhere. He didn't quite know how to answer the question. How did he know he was looking for something? How would it come across if what he was looking for was a squashed bug? Words simply sprung forth from him in his panic, as though pulled out from the man themselves. No, not quite." He looked down to the cockroach. "Maybe?" Looking back up to the mystery man, collecting composure now laced with mild annoyance, he continued. "I don't know." He shook his head automatically. "Sorry, but who are you?" The man laughed to himself with deep, rumbling sputters. "I am sorry. I do not mean to intrude." He reached inside the suit. When his thick fingers retreated, they held delicately a crisp white card that he handed over to Peter. "My name is Munda." He slid the card across the table with 2 fingers. "I like books. In fact, I have quite the collection. But aren't you blind?" Peter gestured with his fingers up and down before realizing the man couldn't even see him motioning. He laughed again. "I was not always, but you are familiar to me. Your voice, the way you walk." He grinned deeper than before. "The library." Peter's face furrowed. He leaned to one side to throw a questioning glance to Vance, hoping his coffee would be ready and he could get rid of this stranger, but Vance was nowhere to be found. "I used to enjoy reading. I have quite the collection. Come and visit. You might find what you're looking for there." "You think I'm just going to show up at some..." Peter began, but the man cut him off with a tap of his cane against the table. "I mean you no harm," he emphasized. "I am just a like-minded individual, one of a kind." He grinned again and gripped his fingers into a claw against the top of his cane. "I hope I'll see you soon." It took Peter a few days to work up the courage to actually show up, checking the card each night he'd stuffed underneath his laptop, and wondering what could possibly go wrong. He'd even looked up the address online, checking pictures of the neighborhood. It was a 2-story home from the late 1800s, made of brick and wood, with a towered room and tall chimney. Given its age, it didn't look too run down, but could use a lick of paint and new curtains to replace the yellowed lace that hung behind the glass. He stood at the iron gate looking down at the card and back up the gravel pavement to the house, finally slipping it back inside his pocket and gripping the cold metal. With a shriek, the rusty entrance swung open, and he made sure to close it back behind him. Gravel crunched underfoot as he made his way towards the man's home. For a moment he paused to reconsider, but nevertheless found himself knocking at the door. From within, the sound of footsteps approached, followed by a clicking and rattling as Mender unlocked the door. "Welcome. Come in, and don't worry about the shoes." He smiled. With a click, the door closed behind him. The house was fairly clean. A rotary phone sat atop a small table in the hallway, and a small cabinet hugged the wall along to the kitchen. Peter could see in the living room a deep green sofa with lace covers thrown across the armrests, while an old radio chanted out in French. It wasn't badly decorated, all things considered, but the walls seemed a little bereft of decoration. It wouldn't benefit him anyway. Mender carefully shuffled to a white door built into the panelling beneath the stairs, turning a brass key he'd left in there. It swung outwards, and he motioned towards it with a smile. "It's all down there. You'll find a little something to tickle any fancy. I am just glad to find somebody who is able to enjoy it now that I cannot." Peter was still a little hesitant. Mender still hadn't turned the light on, likely through habit, but the switch sat outside near the door's frame. "Go on ahead. I will be right with you. I find it rude to not offer refreshments to a guest in my home." "Ah, I'm all right?" Peter said. He didn't entirely trust the man, but didn't want to come off rude at the same time. "I insist." He smiled, walking back towards the kitchen. With his host now gone, Peter flipped the light switch to reveal a dusty wooden staircase leading down into the brick cellar. Gripping the dusty wooden handrail, he finally made his slow descent, step by step. Steadily, the basement came into view. A lone halogen bulb cast a hard light across pile after pile of books, shelves laden with tomes, and a single desk at the far end. All was coated with a sandy covering of dust, and the carapaces of starved spiders clung to thick cobwebs that ran along the room like a fibrous tissue, connecting everything together. Square shadows loomed against the brick like the city's oppressive buildings in the evening sky, and Peter wondered just how long this place had gone untouched. The basement was a large rectangle with the roof held up by metal poles. It was an austere place, unbefitting the aged manuscripts housed within. At first, he wasn't sure where to start, but made his way to the very back of the room to the mahogany desk. Of all the books there in the basement, there was one sitting atop it. It was unlike anything he'd seen. Unable to take his eyes off it, he wheeled back the chair and sat down before lifting it up carefully. It seemed to be intact, but the writing on the spine was weathered beyond recognition. He flicked it open to the first page and instantly knew this wasn't like anything else he'd seen. Against his fingertips, the sensation was smooth, almost slippery, and the writing within wasn't typed or printed. It was handwritten upon sheets of vellum. Through the inky yellowed light, he squinted and peered to read it. But the script appeared to be somewhere between Sanskrit and Tagalog, with swirling letters and double-crossed markings, angled dots and small markings above or below some letters. It was like nothing he'd ever seen before. "So, do you like my collection?" came a voice from behind him. He knew immediately it wasn't Mender. The voice had a croaking growl to it, almost a guttural clicking from within. It wasn't discernibly male or female, but it was enough to make his heart jump out of his throat as he spun the chair around, holding onto the table with one hand. Looking up, he bore witness to a tall figure, but his eyes couldn't adjust against the harsh light from above. All he saw was a hooded shape, lithe, gangly, their outline softened by the halogen's glow. A cold hand reached out to his shoulder. Paralyzed by fear, he sunk deeper into his seat, unable to look away, and yet unable to focus through the darkness as the figure leaned in closer. "I know what you're looking for." The hand clasped and squeezed against his shoulder, almost in urgency. "What I'm looking for," they hissed to themselves, a breathy laugh, "are eyes." Their other hand reached up. Peter saw long, menacing talons reach up to the figure's hood. They removed it and took a step to the side. It was enough for the light to scoop around them slightly, illuminating part of their face. They didn't have skin, rather chitin. A solid plate of charcoal black armor with thick hairs protruding from it. The sockets for its eyes, all 5 of them, were concave, pushed in or missing entirely, leaving a hollow hole. His mind scanned quickly for what kind of creature this thing might be related to, but its layout was unfamiliar to him. How such a thing existed was secondary to his survival. In this moment, escape was the only thing on his mind. "I need eyes to read my books. You seek books without even reading them." The hand reached up to his face, scooping their fingers around his cheek. They felt hard, but not as cold as he had assumed they might. His eyes widened and stared violently down at the wrist he could see, formulating a plan for his escape. "I pity you." They stood upright before he had a chance to try to grab them and toss them aside. "So much knowledge, and you ignore it. But don't think me unfair. No." They hissed. "I'll give you a chance." Reaching into their cloak, they pulled out a brass hourglass, daintily clutching it from the top. "If you manage to leave my library before I catch you, you're free to go. If not, your eyes will be mine. And don't even bother trying to hide. I can hear you. I can smell you." They leaned in again, the mandibles that hung from their face quivering and clacking. "I can taste you in the air." Peter's heart was already beating a mile a minute. The stairs were right there. He didn't even need the advantage, but the fear alone already had him sweating. The creature before him removed their cloak, draping him in darkness. For a moment there was nothing but the clacking and ticking of their sounds from the other side, but then they tossed it aside. The light was suddenly blinding, but as he squinted through it, he saw the far wall with the stairs receding away from him, the wall stretching, and the floor pulling back as the ceiling lifted higher and higher. The light drawing further away, but still shining with a voraciousness like the summer's sun. "What the fuck?" he exclaimed to himself. His attention returned to the creature before him in all his horrifying glory. They lowered themselves down onto 3 pairs of legs that ended in claws for gripping and climbing, shaking a fattened thorax behind them. Spiked hairs protruded from each leg, and their heads shook from side to side. He could tell from the way it was built that it would be fast. The legs were long, they could cover a lot of ground with each stride, and their slender nature belied the muscle that sat within. When I hear the last grain of sand fall, the hunt is on. The creature's claws gripped the timer from the bottom, ready to begin. With a dramatic raise and slam back down, it began. Peter pushed himself off the table, using the wheels of the chair to get a rolling start as he started running. Quickly, his eyes darted across the scene in front of him. Towering bookshelves as far as he could see. Huge dune-like piles of books littered the floor, and shelves still growing from seemingly nowhere before collapsing into a pile with the rest. The sound of fluttering pages and collapsing shelves surrounded him, drowning out his panicked breaths. A more open path appeared to the left between a number of bookcases, with leather-bound tomes, old, gnarled, rising out of the ground as he passed them. He'd have to stay as straight as possible to cut off as much distance as he could, but he already knew it wouldn't be easy. Already a shelf stood in his way with a path to its right, but it blocked his view of what lay ahead. Holding a hand out to swing around it, he sprinted past and hooked himself around before running forward, taking care not to slip on one of the many books already scattered about the floor. He ran beyond shelf after shelf, the colours of the spines a mere blur, books clattering to the ground behind him. A slender, tall shelf was already toppling over before him, leaning over to the side as piles of paper cascaded through the air. Quickly, he calculated the time it would take to hit the wall and pushed himself faster, narrowly missing it as it smashed into other units, throwing more to the concrete floor. Before him now lay a small open area filled with a mountain of books, beyond which he could see more shelving rising far up into the roof and bursting open, throwing down a waterfall of literature. "Fuck!" he huffed, leaping and throwing himself at the mound. Scrambling, he pulled and kicked his way against shifting volumes, barely moving. His scrabbling and scrambling were getting him nowhere as the ground moved from beneath him with each action. Pulling himself closer, lowering his center of gravity, he made himself more deliberate, smartly taking his time instead, pushing down against the mass of hardbacks as he made his ascent. Steadily, far too slowly given the creature's imminent advance, he made his way to the apex. For just a moment, he looked on for some semblance of a path, but everything was twisting and changing too fast. By the time he made it anywhere, it would have already changed and warped into something entirely different. The best way, he reasoned, was up. Below him, another shelf was rising up from beneath the mound of books. Quickly, he sprung forward and landed on his heels to ride down across the surface of the hill before leaning himself forward to make a calculated leap forward, grasping onto the top of the shelf and scrambling up. His fears rose at the sound of creaking and felt the metal beneath him begin to buckle. It began to topple forwards, and if he didn't act fast, he would crash down 3 stories onto the concrete below. He waited for a second, scanning his surroundings as quickly as he could, and leapt at the best moment to grab onto another tall shelf in front of him. That one too began to topple, but he was nowhere near the top. In his panic, he froze up as the books slid from the wooden shelves, clinging as best he could to the metal. Abruptly, he was thrown against it, iron bashing against his cheek, but he still held on. It was at an angle, propped up against another bracket. The angle was steep, but Peter still tried to climb it. Up he went, hopping with one foot against the side and the other jumping across the wooden slats. He hopped down to a rack lower down, then to another, darting along a wide shelf before reaching ground level again. Not where he wanted to be, but he'd have to work his way back up to a safe height. A shelf fell directly in his path, not so far away from him. Another came, and another, each one closer than the last. He looked up and saw one about to hit him. With the combined weight of the books and the shelving, he'd be done for in one strike. He didn't have time to stop, but instead leapt forward, diving and rolling across a few scattered books. A few toppled down across his back, but he pressed on, grasping the ledge of the unit before him and swinging through above the books it once held. Suddenly, there came a call, a bellowing, echoed screech across the hall. It was coming. Panicking, panting, he looked again for the exit. All he had been focused on was forward, but how far? He wasn't sure he'd be able to make it, but now that he had no sight of it in this labyrinth of paper, he grew fearful. He scrambled up a diagonally collapsed shelf, running up and leaping across the tops of others, jumping between them. He couldn't look back. He wouldn't. It was simply a distraction from his escape. Another shelf lay perched precariously between two others at an angle, its innards strewn across the floor, save for a few tomes caught in its wiry limbs. With a heavy jump, he pushed against the top of the tall bookshelf he was on, ready to swing from it onto the next step, but it moved back from under his feet. Suddenly, he found himself in freefall, collapsing forwards through the air. With a thump, he landed on a pile of paperbacks, rolling out of it to dissipate the energy from the fall, but it wasn't enough. Winded, he scrambled to his feet and wheezed for a second to catch his breath. He was sore, his muscles burned, and even his lungs felt as though they were on fire. Battered and bruised, he knew he couldn't stop. He had to press on. Slowly at first, his feet began to move again, then faster, faster. Tall bookcases still rose and collapsed before him, and he took care to weave in and out of them, keeping one eye out above for dangers. Another rack was falling in his path, but he found himself unable to outrun the long unit this time. It was as long as a warehouse shelving unit, packed with heavy hardbacks, tilting towards him. "Oh, fuck!" he exclaimed, bracing himself as he screeched to a halt. Peering through his raised arms, he tucked himself into a squat and shuffled to the side to calculate what was coming. Buffeted by book after book, some hitting him square in the head, the racks came clattering down around him. He'd been lucky enough to be sitting right between its shelves, and spared no time clambering his way out and running along the cleared path atop it. At its terminus, however, was another long unit, almost perpendicular with the freshly fallen one that seemed like a wall before him. Behind it, between gaps in the novels, he could see other ledges falling and collapsing beyond. Still running as fast as his weary body would allow, he planned his route. He leapt from the long shelf atop one that was still rising to his left, hopping across platform to platform as he approached the wall of manuscripts, jumping headfirst through a gap, somersaulting into the unknown beyond. He landed on another hill of books, sliding down, this time with nowhere to jump to. Peter's legs gave way, crumpling beneath him as he fell to his back and slid down. He moaned out in pain, agony, exhaustion, wanting this whole experience to be over, but was stirred into action by the sound of that shrieking approaching closer, shelving units being tossed aside and books being ploughed out the way. Gasping now, he pushed on, hobbling and staggering forward as he tried to find that familiar rhythm, trying to match his feet to the rapid beating of his heart. Making his way around another winding path, he found it was blocked and had to climb up shelf after shelf, all the while the creature gaining on him. He feared the worst, but finally reached the top and followed the path before him back down. Suddenly, a heavy metal yawn called out as a colossal tidal wave of tomes collapsed to one side and a metal frame came tumbling down. This time, it crashed directly through the concrete, revealing another level to this maze beneath it. It spanned on into an inky darkness below, the concrete clattering and echoing against the floor in that shadow amongst the flopping of books as they joined it. A path remained to the side, but he had no time, no choice but to hurtle forwards, jumping with all his might towards the hole, grasping onto the bent metal frame and cutting open one of his hands on the jagged metal. Screams burst from between his breaths as he pulled himself upwards, forwards, climbing, crawling onwards bit by bit with agonizing movements towards the end of the bent metal frame that spanned across to the other side with nothing but a horrible death below. A hissing scream bellowed across the cavern, echoing in the labyrinth below as the creature reached the wall, but Peter refused to look back. It was a distraction, a second he didn't have to spare. At last he could see the stairs, those dusty old steps that lead up against the brick. Hope had never looked so mundane. Still, the brackets and mantles rose and fell around him. Still came the deafening rustle and thud of falling books, and still he pressed on. Around, above, and finally approaching a path clear, save for a spread of scattered books. From behind he could hear frantic, frenzied steps approaching with full haste. The clicking and clattering of the creature's mandibles instilling him with fear. Kicking a few of the scattered books as he stumbled and staggered towards the stairs at full speed, unblinking, unflinching, his arms flailing wildly as his body began to give way. His foot finally made contact with the thin wooden step, but a claw wildly grasped at his jacket. He pulled against it with everything he had left, but it was too strong after his ordeal, instead moving his arms back to slip out of it. Still the creature screeched and screamed, and still he dared not look back, rushing his way to the top of the stairs and slamming the door behind him. Blood trickled down the white-painted paneling, and he slumped to the ground, collapsing in sheer exhaustion. Bzzzt! The electronic buzzing of his apartment's doorbell called out from the hallway. With a wheeze, Peter pushed himself out of bed, rubbing a bandaged hand against his throbbing head. He tossed aside the sheets and leaned forward, using his body's weight to rise to his feet, sliding on a pair of backless slippers. Groaning, he pulled on a blood-speckled grey tank top and made his way past the kitchen to his door to peer through the murky peephole. There was nobody there, but at the bottom of the fisheye scene beyond was the top of a box. Curious, he slid open the chain and turned the lock, rubbing the sleep from his eyes with his good hand. Left, right. He peered into the liminal hallway to see who might have been there. He didn't even know what time it was, but sure enough they delivered a small cardboard box without any kind of marking. Grabbing it with one hand, he brought it back over to the kitchen and lazily pulled open a drawer to grab a knife. Carefully, he slit open the brown tape that sealed it. It had a musty kind of smell and was slightly gritty to the touch, but he was too curious to stop. It felt almost familiar. In the dim coolness of his apartment, he peered within to find bugs, exotic insects of all kinds. All flat, dry, preserved. On top was a note from a like-minded individual. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to bloody subscribe, or the dream demons might pay you a visit. Sleep tight.